Imagine planning a road trip around a restaurant that is closed 6 days a week. Not a Michelin-starred dining room in New York. Not a celebrity restaurant in Los Angeles. Not even a famous barbecue destination in Austin. This place sits in Lexington, Texas, a small rural community with a population of roughly 1,100 people. On a quiet morning, you might hear cattle somewhere down the road. There are no skyscrapers here, no giant entertainment district, and very little to suggest that people would travel hundreds or even thousands of miles just to eat lunch. And yet, every Saturday, something unusual happens. People begin gathering outside a small barbecue restaurant called Snow's Barbecue. Some arrive early in the morning. Others are so determined to be near the front that they show up Friday evening, hours before the restaurant opens. They come from California, Florida, Colorado, New Hampshire, Iowa, Arizona, and places far beyond Texas. Some have talked about making this trip for years, and all of this raises an obvious question. How did a tiny barbecue joint that opens only one day a week become one of the most famous barbecue destinations in Texas? The easy answer is that Snow's serves great barbecue, but that doesn't explain everything. Because to understand Snow's, you have to go back to a time when almost nobody outside this little part of Texas knew its name. The story begins with two people who had known each other for a very long time. Kerry Bexley was born and raised in Lexington. He had known Tootsie Tomanetz since he was a young boy running around town. At the time, neither of them could have imagined that one day they would work together at a barbecue restaurant known around the world. Around 2002, Kerry approached Tootsie with an idea. What if they opened a barbecue place? They sat down in Kerry's shop and talked for several hours. Eventually, Kerry asked whether they could be ready to open by the 1st of March. Tootsie's response revealed a lot about the woman who would eventually become the face of Snow's. She was essentially ready to go. If Kerry could get the pits ready, she could start cooking. So Kerry began building them. These weren't polished, computer-controlled commercial smokers designed by a restaurant equipment company. Kerry built the pits himself. He has joked about the craftsmanship not being anything extraordinary, but more than 2 decades later, those pits are part of the identity of the restaurant. On March 1, 2021, Snow's Barbecue opened, and it opened with an unusual schedule, Saturdays only. For the next 5 years, Snow's continued doing its thing in Lexington. Then came 2008. Texas Monthly recognized Snow's as the #1 barbecue destination in Texas. Almost overnight, the context changed. This little Saturday barbecue operation suddenly had a much larger audience. People who had never heard of Lexington now had a reason to find it on a map. But recognition creates another question. A magazine ranking can convince someone to visit once. It cannot, by itself, explain why a restaurant develops a devoted following for years. So what exactly was Snow's doing that made it different? To answer that, you have to understand Tootsie. Tootsie did not begin her career with the goal of becoming a Texas barbecue icon. In fact, she entered the business almost by accident. It was 1966. Her husband worked at a meat market in Giddings, Texas. One day, the business was short-handed, and the owner asked whether Tootsie could come in and help. She did. One day became a week became a month, and a temporary job eventually became years of her life. Tootsie and her husband later bought the meat market themselves, and she spent roughly 2 decades running it. Eventually, after her husband suffered a stroke, they had to let the business go. But the knowledge didn't disappear. By the time Snow's opened in 2003, Tootsie had already spent decades around meat, fire, and barbecue. That matters because Snow's represents a style of cooking that comes from an era before modern craft barbecue became obsessed with digital temperature probes, precisely documented recipes, and expensive custom smokers. At Snow's, numbers matter, but experience matters more. You look at the meat, you touch it, you smell what's happening, you understand how your pit behaves, you recognize which part is running hotter, you know when something needs to move, and after doing it for enough years, much of that knowledge becomes instinctive. That helps explain why Tootsie became so important to Snow's, but it introduces another mystery. If Snow's eventually became one of the best-known barbecue restaurants in Texas, why didn't it modernize everything? Why continue using cooking methods that require so much manual work? The answer is sitting behind the restaurant. glowing red beneath the meat. Walk into the cooking area at Snow's, and you can see two different philosophies operating at once. Briskets are handled on their own pits, but some of the most interesting cooking happens over direct heat. Pork steaks and chickens are cooked above hot coals, using a method that has become much less common, as indirect smokers have taken over modern barbecue. The concept sounds simple. Meat sits above the coals, but what happens between them is crucial. As the pork and chicken cook, fat drips downward. Mop sauce falls onto the hot coals. Those drippings hit the heat below, producing smoke and aromas that rise back toward the meat. It creates a cycle. Meat, drippings, coals, smoke, meat. Carrie readily acknowledges something important about this method. It isn't the most economical way to cook, and that's exactly what makes Snow's interesting. Restaurants normally try to eliminate inefficiency. If a process requires too much labor, too much attention, or too much fuel, the logical business response is to replace it. Snow's has kept doing it. Why? Because for them, direct coal cooking isn't simply a production method. It is part of what barbecue was. And perhaps no item demonstrates that better than the pork steak. The pork steak begins as pork shoulder, cut into thick steaks. At Snow's, it can cook for more than 6 hours. Think about that for a moment. 6 hours for pork steak. Even chicken can remain on the pit for around 6 hours or more. Could it be cooked faster? Of course. But that isn't the goal. In fact, one of the easiest ways to get this style of barbecue wrong is to rush it. Then there is the mop sauce. Snow's uses a mixture that includes ingredients such as water, onion, butter, Worcestershire sauce, mustard, and vinegar. It adds flavor, but it also helps keep the meat moist during the long cooking process. And yet, even here, Snow's refuses to behave like a modern laboratory. There isn't necessarily a precise digital recipe measured down to the gram every time. Different cooks may make it a little differently. The process depends partly on feel. There is even a wonderfully simple way of judging the vinegar. Smell it. If the vinegar is strong enough to make you want to cough, you're probably getting close. It's old-fashioned, imperfect, and intensely human. And that leads to a much bigger problem. This kind of cooking sounds manageable when you're preparing dinner for a family, but Snow's isn't feeding one family. On Saturday morning, there may be a long line of hungry customers outside. So how can a restaurant cook this way at scale? That is where Clay Cowgill enters the story. Clay started working at Snow's in 2015, but his connection to Tootsie goes back much further. He had known her since he was a small child. Tootsie even remembered an incident when he was very young and nearly choked while eating at the meat market. Years later, he returned as an adult and became one of the key people responsible for Snow's barbecue. His Friday shift can begin around 6:30 or 7:30 in the evening. At roughly 7, the fire gets going. Around 8:30, the briskets go on, and then the long night begins. The briskets described in Snow's process are around 7 pounds and cook for roughly 9 to 10 hours. About 5 or 6 hours into the cook, they are wrapped in aluminum foil, where they continue cooking. Snow's brisket pit can hold more than 600 pounds during a cook. That sounds impressive, but capacity is not the difficult part. Attention is. A barbecue pit isn't necessarily one perfectly uniform environment. One area can run hotter, another can be cooler. So Clay has to know where the briskets are and how they are progressing. He moves them, he rotates them. A brisket sitting in a hotter section may need to switch places with one in a cooler area, and he has to remember what he has already done. Clay once joked that he gives the briskets names. When someone asked him the name of one, he called it Bert. 10 minutes later, the same person showed him the same brisket again. Clay recognized it. "Why are you showing me Bert again?" The joke reveals something serious about the job. He really is paying attention to individual pieces of meat. And as the night progresses, the workload grows. At 2 or 3 in the morning, Clay can be responsible for roughly 130 pieces of barbecue, sometimes describing the job as watching around 150 pieces. For hours, he may barely sit down. There is fire to manage, meat to move, temperatures to understand, color to watch, fat to render, and mistakes can happen quickly. Clay says that during the brisket cooking process, being distracted for even a short period can create problems. That is also why he doesn't listen to music while cooking. He wants to hear the pit. A burning log can shift, something can hit a door, the fire can change. If Clay is wearing headphones or drowning the environment in music, he may miss the sound that tells him something is wrong. For many people, this kind of shift would feel unbearable. For Clay, something strange happens. The busier he becomes, the quieter his mind feels. He describes his brain as something that never stops, almost like a storm. But when he is sweating in the middle of the night, exhausted and responsible for more than 100 pieces of barbecue, he has no time to think about anything else. The chaos becomes a kind of meditation. And this gives us another question. If the restaurant doesn't open until Saturday morning, why does so much work begin Friday evening? To understand that, you have to see Snow's not as a restaurant shift, but as an overnight countdown. At around 8:30 on Friday night, the briskets are already cooking. Most customers are still at home. Some may be eating dinner somewhere else. Others may be sleeping hours later, without realizing that the barbecue they will eat the next morning is already being watched carefully in Lexington. Around midnight, Clay lights another large firebox. This fire isn't simply for the briskets. It is being prepared so Carrie will have coals for pork steaks and chickens. Clay keeps feeding that fire throughout the cook. Then, around 1 or 1:30 in the morning, Carrie arrives. At roughly 2, pork and chicken go on. Now multiple systems are operating at once. Clay has his indirect cooking. Carrie has his direct heat pits. Ribs need attention. Pork steaks need attention. Chicken needs attention. Mop sauce has to be applied. Meat must be moved between hotter and cooler zones. On the ribs, Carrie watches for visual and physical signs of doneness, rather than relying only on a clock. The pork steaks are judged by look and feel. Clay checks brisket tenderness by touching and probing the lean portion, because the fattier end will soften sooner. The night continues. Then, around 5 in the morning, more members of the family begin arriving. By approximately 6:30 or 7, Tootsie comes in. Years earlier, she would have been involved in starting the fires herself. Now she arrives later and helps finish the pork and chicken. For Tootsie, even reducing her workload has not necessarily been an easy transition. She has spent a lifetime wanting to have her hands in the work. And then, at almost exactly the same time that the overnight cooks are reaching the final stretch, another group begins changing the atmosphere completely. The customers arrive. For Clay, seeing them around 6:30 in the morning feels like getting a second breath. After spending all night with the fires, he can finally see who the work is for. But this raises perhaps the strangest question of all. Who wakes up this early just to eat barbecue? The answer is that some of them didn't wake up early. Some of them have been waiting since the night before. Lexington has only around 1,100 residents. Yet on Saturday morning, the crowd outside Snow's can look like it belongs somewhere much larger. Visitors come from across the United States. In the source story, customers mention places including California, Colorado, Florida, New Hampshire, and Iowa. Others have traveled from Arizona, and Snow's has welcomed visitors from around the world. Some people have wanted to make the trip for years. One person at Snow's recalled that over a period of many years, there was perhaps only 1 week when nobody was already on the porch by 1 in the morning. Think about what that means. The cooks are working overnight, and outside, the first customers may already be waiting. 2 separate rituals are happening simultaneously, one around the fire, the other in the line. Eventually, the line itself became part of the Snow's experience. People talk. They meet strangers. The restaurant holds raffles. There is merchandise. There is even a social atmosphere developing long before most people would normally consider eating barbecue. By the time Snow's opens, customers have not simply walked through a door and ordered food. They have participated in an event. And once inside, the pace doesn't suddenly become industrial. Snow's sells its barbecue by the pound. The meat is sliced in front of customers as they move through. The restaurant does not define the experience around rushing people through as quickly as possible. There's another important detail. Snow's says it does not follow the practice of cooking barbecue one day and holding it in warmers to sell the next. Instead, when more meat is needed inside, a runner comes out to the cooking area and gets it. This is barbecue built around a specific Saturday service, which finally gives us an answer to the question of why people wait. Yes, the food matters. Of course it does. But customers aren't merely buying a pound of smoked meat, they are buying a Saturday morning at Snow's. And once you realize that, another question appears. What if the food itself isn't the most important thing Snow's has created? Clay's story offers one of the best answers. When he returned to Snow's as an adult, he ate the pork steak. The flavor did something unexpected. It took him back to childhood. He remembered himself at 3 or 4 years old, sitting there and eating, his feet swinging beneath him. Decades had passed, but the bite felt familiar. The same food had become a bridge between two versions of his life. That is extraordinarily difficult for a restaurant to manufacture. A company can buy the same type of smoker. It can study a recipe. It can copy a menu. It can use the same cut of pork. But it cannot instantly create decades of shared memory. Snow's has accumulated that slowly. And nowhere is that more visible than in Tootsie's life. Her story did not become easier after Snow's became famous. In December 2015, she lost her husband. In March 2016, she lost her son. Two enormous losses came within only a few months. Tootsie speaks about those events through her faith. Those doors, she says, had closed and were not coming back. But other doors opened. She continued working. She continued meeting people. And as her fame grew, visitors began traveling to Snow's, not only to eat her barbecue, but to meet her and take a photograph with her. What does she value about that attention? Not the certificates, not the awards. She talks about the joy of seeing someone's face light up when they recognize her. That says a lot about why Snow's feels different from a restaurant built around rapid expansion. The people are part of the product, and the next generation is already there. Carrie's son Kobe has taken responsibility for sausage. His daughter Lissa works with the to-go operation. The children grew up alongside the business. Carrie's hope for the future isn't expressed simply as a desire for more locations or higher sales. He hopes his children can continue Snow's after he is gone, if that is what they choose. Because after more than 20 years, Snow's has become something larger than a place where meat is cooked. It has become a collection of relationships. Family relationships, relationships between cooks, relationships with customers, relationships across generations of Texas barbecue. One line in the story captures this perfectly. The memories here are better than the barbecue. That sounds almost impossible for a restaurant that became famous because of its food. But perhaps that is exactly the point, and it brings us back to the question we started with. Why is Snow's still open only 1 day a week? From a conventional business perspective, Snow's seems almost backward. Imagine telling a restaurant consultant that you have a famous business where customers travel from across the country and line up hours before opening. What would the obvious advice be? Open more days, increase production, serve more customers, make the process more efficient, perhaps open another location, then another. Turn the reputation into scale. That is how modern businesses are usually expected to grow. But look at what would have to change. Snow's Saturday begins Friday evening. The briskets go onto the pit. Fires are maintained through the night. Around midnight, more fire is prepared for the direct pits. Carrie arrives after 1 in the morning. Pork and chicken begin cooking around 2. More family members arrive as sunrise approaches. Tootsie comes in around 6:30 or 7. Customers gather outside. The restaurant opens. The meat is sliced. People eat. And eventually, the cycle ends. Then another week begins. This isn't simply a restaurant opening for a shift. It is almost a weekly ritual. The pits Carrie built when Snow's began are still part of the operation. Cooking methods connected to Tootsie's decades of experience remain alive. Clay still spends the night listening to the fire. Carrie still cooks over direct coals, even though he knows there are more economical ways to do it. The family still works alongside one another, and people still drive to a town of roughly 1,100 residents because Saturday morning in Lexington offers something they cannot get simply by ordering barbecue somewhere closer to home. So perhaps the original question was wrong. Maybe we shouldn't ask, how did Snow's become famous, despite being open only 1 day a week? Maybe we should ask, did being open only 1 day a week help preserve the very thing that made Snow's famous? Because scarcity changes the experience. Waiting changes it. Watching barbecue come directly from the cooking area changes it. Knowing that people have been working through the night changes it. Meeting Tootsie changes it. Eating a pork steak cooked by a method that makes little sense from a modern efficiency standpoint changes it. All of those things give Snows something that is almost impossible to franchise, a sense of place. Snows belongs to Lexington. It belongs to Saturday. It belongs to those old pits. It belongs to the people standing beside them. And that may be the real secret. In modern barbecue, it is possible to measure almost everything. Temperature, cooking time, weight, yield, wood consumption, food cost, labor, customers per hour. But some of the things that make Snows special are much harder to put on a spreadsheet. How much is a childhood memory worth? How much is 60 years of cooking experience worth? How much is it worth to stand in line at sunrise beside people who traveled from 5 different states for the same meal? How do you measure the value of a pitmaster who can look at dozens of pieces of meat and remember exactly where each one needs to go? And how do you reproduce a woman like Tootsie? You probably can't. That is why Snows' story isn't ultimately about discovering a secret ingredient. There isn't one magical rub. There isn't one revolutionary smoker. There isn't one trick that explains everything. The real recipe has taken decades. It began before Snows even existed. It began in meat markets, in old barbecue pits, in small Texas communities, and in the accumulated experience of people who learned to cook without expecting anyone outside their hometown to care. Then Snows opened in 2003. Texas Monthly discovered it in 2008. The world eventually arrived. But the remarkable thing isn't simply that Snows became famous. The remarkable thing is how much of the old Snows survived after fame arrived. The pits are still burning. The pork steaks are still cooking slowly. The briskets are still watched through the night. Tootsie still comes to work. The family is still there. And every Saturday, people still make their way to Lexington. Some come for brisket. Some come for pork steak. Some come because they saw Snows on television or read about it. Some want a photograph with Tootsie. And some may not fully understand why the experience matters until years later, when a smell or a bite suddenly takes them back to that Saturday morning in a tiny Texas town. Maybe that's why the memories can become better than the barbecue. And it leaves one final question. If Snows opened 7 days a week, replaced its labor-intensive methods, expanded across Texas, and made the entire experience easier to reproduce, would it still be Snows?